that's messed up is that what happens if you put that road or that barrier between the mangrove forest and the ocean? In other words, you're blocking the tidal connectivity between that mangrove forest and the ocean. And this is a scenario depicted right here, where in this illustration, where this site that was developed under tidal conditions has now been cut off from those tides, and it's now having to deal with the stress imposed by a natural condition for mangroves. And this is the condition that a lot of you see in Southwest Florida when you drive around. If you start looking at the mangrove swamps that you typically drive by, and look at them with a keen eye, you'll see a lot of dead branches. Of course, you've had Hurricane Irma just recently, so that's, I mean, it's going to be confounded. It's going to be hard to pick this out probably right now. But this is a system that the mangrove's alive. It hasn't died yet, but this particular forest is under intense stress. And eventually what happens is this concept of a mangrove heart attack. This idea was coined by Robin Lewis, and we've been studying it ever since. It's really kind of cool. What happens is this system is under persistent stress for many, many decades. And then a large storm or some other kind of acute environmental stressor will come, and it becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. It knocks it over the edge and it kills it. And so basically what happens is, here's your flying in ghosts. These are the things I want to just point out and make very specific points for. And then eventually this particular system can become a dead forest. And so the analogies to heart attack are probably pretty obvious. Years of neglect, letting your health go, lead to an acute event that isn't so good. But what do you think is typically blamed for this mentality? And I can tell you that all over the world, people always want to blame one big acute event for this mortality. But that's not really the cause of it. What really causes it? Well, for Fruit Farm Creek, there's 3 really broad areas of items that have caused this mangrove heart attack to exist. And it's important to understand what caused it to exist, what caused it to occur, because there's a lot more forests out there. There's 240 acres or so just in that Fruit Farm Creek area. But there are a lot of mangroves in Southwest Florida that are undergoing this persistent hydrological stress that could use some intervention in order to keep it healthy in time. But for Fruit Farm Creek, we have altered hydrology, which is in this sense cutting off the tide. We have changes in the soil that affect tree growth. So as the soil condition shifts a little bit, a lot of our soils are, the mangroves can really tolerate a lot of really tough soil conditions, but there's a limit for even mangroves. And then there's this process, that limit gives rise in this case to this process of peat collapse that occurs over time. So, okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk about each one of these 3 things individually, but I wanna introduce sort of the site and the experimental design first. Okay, so this is the Fruit Farm Creek restoration site. This is County Road 92 connecting. This is the bridge coming off. This is Goodland, the bridge, and this is of course Marco Island and the greater community of Marco. This is Key Marco or Hors Island development. There's a 10-acre die-off here. There's a 50-acre die-off here. This is the die-off that is really the eyesore when you drive into Key Marco. This is the dead mangroves that you see. And then there's a smaller die-off right here of about 4 acres in size. And this is, so we've set up 4 transects. We put 2 of our transects on the 4-acre area because in 2012, some of you are probably involved with this. There was a grassroots restoration effort where some of the tidal exchange was reconnected in this area. And Corey's going to show you some photo time series of this change that is really kind of impressive. So it's already being restored. But this restoration is going to focus on these different sites here. This road was built in 1938. So that's when this issue started happening. So this system has been unhealthy ever since that. It's just been hanging on because mangroves do that. They're very stress adapted. They do what they can. Each one of these transects have three forest conditions. We have a full canopy forest. Don't don't think this is a healthy forest. This is just a full canopy forest. It's a forest that has a fairly close canopy. You feel like it's a pretty healthy forest, but I'll show you data to suggest it's not. Transitional forest, this is what a lot of you see from the roads. You'll see kind of a mix of dead and live trees along the transition. And then you have a dead mangrove forest. This is that ghost forest, right, that we don't want to see anymore. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is take you through altered hydrology, the changes in soil condition that begets changes in forest structure, and then finally this idea of peak collapse. So altered hydrology. Okay, so I'm going to start out with this is a hydrograph, also from Rookery Bay, that shows you a natural hydrology, a natural basin mangrove. This is how a natural basin mangrove should look. So on the y-axis is water level. 0 represents the ground level. So this is the soil surface. Anything below is below the ground surface. Anything above is above the ground surface. One of the first things I want to point out to you is that notice that mangroves, natural mangrove systems are drained more often than they are flooded. This is natural condition of mangroves globally. They're drained far less. Many mangrove systems are drained for more than 25% of the year. A lot of people think they're permanently flooded systems, but they're not. And so this is your dry season. This is your wet season. So there's some changes in the flooding, but you'll see that, you know, these tidal pulses flood the surface of the soil and it drains pretty quickly, so on and so forth. And this is really, this is what we want. Here's what the sites at Fruit Farm Creek looks like. This is actually a hydrograph from Boers Island that was existing before the storm. We actually thought this site was going to be somewhat of a reference, but it turns out that the hydrology is bad. We worry about its recovery after Hurricane Irma because of this. But you can see long-term periods of flooding. You know, the draining periods are, you know, not that much different than you see from a natural tide, but you don't get the pulsing, you don't get the tides. So this becomes very much a system that these mangroves are not adapted to. So imprint this in your head. This is where the ghosts, this guy's hanging 10 on this particular hydrograph. So that's the hydrology. That's how different it looks. Well, what does that end up doing for us over time? Well, if you look at this figure, this is sort of I'm going to first of all talk about the changes in biomass that you see along these transects. And then I'm going to tell you why this biomass is so different. The y-axis represents, basically this is biomass. So a megagram of carbon is just a different way to think of biomass. A megagram is equivalent to a metric ton of carbon, or biomass in this case. So what we're looking at for the full canopy sites, the ones that have a closed canopy but aren't necessarily, I mean, they're stressed. The transitional forests, they're beginning to be very stressed. And then of course the dead forest. One thing to note is that obviously you have more live trees in the live forest. That makes a lot of sense. But one thing that I think was really odd here is look at the number of dead trees above ground, the biomass of dead trees. There's a lot of dead trees in this full canopy forest. And this is a classic sign that even the forests that are live and look like they're doing okay from just with the naked eye, there's a lot of stress in those systems. So it's just a matter of time before these full canopy sites become transitional. And in fact, some of our full canopy sites have become transitional since we set them up. But another thing that's really interesting though, is that we took soil cores down to 50 centimeters and we found no differences in biomass of organic matter biomass below ground on those soils. One reason for that, I'll expand on in a second, is that as these sites, the full canopy sites, have a lot of live roots. Transitional sites have a lot less live roots, but they have live roots. And then you get to the dead sites where the roots have died. Organic matter starts decomposing. Now, organic matter decomposes slow in wetlands, but it still decomposes. And as it decomposes, the soils compress. So this 50 centimeter core may represent, 70, 80 centimeters if you were to compare it to a healthy core, such as a full canopy forest, for example. So you're compressing more soil into the same area, so you're making it denser. And I'll show you some images of that in a second. So what changed in the soil? Well, the first thing that happened was low dissolved oxygen of the soils when flooded. This is really interesting because, again, a lot of people think mangroves can handle low oxygen conditions in the soil, and they can for a time. But the dissolved oxygen on some of these sites, some of the dead zones were 0 milligrams per liter of oxygen. Is really low. These sites, we think they're definitely flooded too long, and in some cases they may actually be drained too long. But the bottom line is that they're unflushed. And then I'll mention that they're also, this is a sign of degradation, that low phosphorus content in the soil. As a comparison, phosphorus levels at Fruit Farm Creek are about 30 to 55% of what they are on other basin mangrove sites along Henderson Creek, also in Mercury Bay. So quite low. It's just not, the phosphorus just isn't recycled properly on this particular site. Okay, so the final part of this is peak collapse. And this one's a little bit interesting to sort of think about. So again, let me orient you. The full canopy sites, the transitional sites, and then the dead sites. On the x-axis, this is bulk density, and this is what, bulk density. It's in grams per cubic centimeters. So bulk density is a measure of basically just how dense the soil is. If you have a low value, the soil's not so dense. If you have a high value, the soil is dense. And this is depth into the soil. So if you're looking at 0 to 50 centimeters into the soil, I have it as a negative value here, but this is basically taking a core into the soil, and we section those cores. Look at the full canopy bulk density. The green represents the active root zone. So the active root zone of the full canopy forest reaches down to about 40 centimeters, a little bit beyond at times. But the bulk density profiles start out low and then sort of gradually go up a little bit higher. And this is a pretty classic response, although there's a few issues with this particular diagram. But what happens is, as you have more live roots, you have lower bulk densities because roots are, they just don't, they're not as dense. As you take that same core, you go to the transitional forest nearby, what you'll notice is that the live root zone stops at about 20 centimeters into the soil. That's pretty shallow. And we know this because right at this transition, so this looks similar to this one until you get to this 20 centimeter transition. So the soil, the roots have started to die, and as they decompose, the soils compress. This compression increases the density of the soil and increases bulk density by a little bit as you get into this about 20 centimeters into the soil. So these are all compressed soils that occur at this particular location. Now you go to the next stage, which is a dead forest. So this is kind of like representing time as well as space. First of all, I'll get back to this algal microbial layer, but this same compression continues to occur. If you look at the bulk densities for transitional, they're almost all below 0.3. If you look at bulk densities for dead, they're at or above 0.3. So they're getting denser because they're collapsing more and more. And in fact, collapse an additional 6 to 8 centimeters between the transitional and dead forests. Okay, so this is what reduces the elevation of your swamps, of your forest. So that's one of the reasons why your dead zones, in particular in the 10 and 50 acre areas, are seemingly permanently flooded, although sometimes they do get dried out. But in the 10 and 50 acre areas, we also see this prolific algal microbial mat that occurs on the surface, which is kind of cool in and of itself. The 4 acres restoration site, or the 4 acre site, hasn't had the same elevation losses, but they have had some elevation losses. So this is a process of peak collapse that occurs. If you think about taking a live tree, killing it, when you do that, you're no longer replacing the dead roots below ground because the tree no longer puts those fresh roots down. So you're cutting off root turnover, and over time, that biomass is so important that it just loses, it forces a loss of elevation. So what is our responsibility in this? Well, number one, to understand the process, but remember too that science is one of those things that we're often used to doing over and over again repetitively until we understand the processes that are occurring. We only have this one restoration site that we're working on, and we want to get it right the first time. We're able to change things up a little bit over time in terms of adaptive management and maybe changing water flows and things like that over time. But we really want to use the scientific studies that we've conducted to inform what we can do at Fruit Farm Creek. And then my final slide is simply, our goal is to reverse the mangrove forest degradation at Fruit Farm Creek. So today I talked about a full canopy forest becoming a transitional forest, becoming a dead forest. What I want to talk about one day is how we took these dead forests, made them transitional forests, and then made them full canopy forests. Corey will be showing you some pictures of this 4-acre restoration area. This is the area that started getting some restored tidal flows in 2012. And the change already is remarkable. Many of you have seen the change personally, so you know, but it's basically just restoring the tide is all that's been done there. All right, so that's all I have, and I'm going to transition to Corey now.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kraus. Corey, you can go ahead and share your screen. And I just want to remind everyone that you can enter your questions into the question answer box. And if someone else enters a question that you would like to hear answered, go ahead and give it one of those little thumbs up symbols. You'll see it there, and that way we'll be able to prioritize those questions. So at the end, if we have more questions than we have time for, we'll answer the ones that you want to hear. All right, Corey, are you ready to roll?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I want to give you a quick introduction. We have Corey Anderson with us, and he is actually with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Tell us a little bit about what you do and go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Corey. I am with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and I am an aquatic habitat restoration biologist and a project manager for restoration projects in Southwest Florida. I've been working in the Southwest Florida area in environmental assessment and restoration for a little over 8 years now. And I want to give a sincere thanks to Ken for teeing this up for me and explaining some of the science background behind it. I'd like to give you an overview of what we're planning to do to restore Fruit Farm Creek back to its historic condition and get those mangroves back in healthier shape. So this is basically a construction project, restoration project in partnership with Rookery Bay, Department of Environmental Protection, and the city of Marco Island. So you can't have good projects without good partnerships, and you can't make good partnerships without trust and building connections. So in order to build those connections, we have things around Florida called estuarine restoration teams, or ERTs. So these ERTs focus on coastal restoration of a defined region of the coastline, and some of them are outlined here. So the ERTs serve as a forum for habitat restoration practitioners, planners, and professionals to have information exchange about places they want to work out technical issues regarding restoration projects, forge partnerships around large-scale project ideas, and try to figure out how to get these things accomplished and improve the local environment. ERTs have been forming around the state of Florida since about 2010. And it's been federal and state and local agencies, local and national non-governmental organizations, and consultants, which have come together to address large-scale regional habitat degradation and wetland loss. So the Southwest Florida Estuarine Restoration Team, nicknamed the SWIRT, formed in 2018 with about 60 partners. So within the SWIRT, restoration groups from across the region have shared their successes and challenges, lessons learned, and planned for ways to implement scientifically based restoration on large landscape scale. The SWIRT was partly responsible for helping to bring together the researchers and land managers at Rookery Bay, City of Marco Island, FWC, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration Southeast Regional Office to really focus on Fruit Farm Creek. I got to give a shout out to some other partners for Fruit Farm Creek, such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Conservancy of Southwest Florida, USGS, the Ecology Group, J.R. Evans Engineering, Coastal Resources Group, and as Ken mentioned, a lot of local resident donors and volunteers. So those partnerships really led to the opportunity for some good fish habitat restoration at Fruit Farm Creek. The connections that were made between planners and managers has led us to identify the 60-acre mangrove die-off, which I'll outline here in yellow, and also about 150 acres of sort of stressed out mangroves that are in danger of dying off or exacerbating the problem, making the area bigger. So they're showing some classic signs of stress within the leaves, losing chlorophyll, and also a little bit of that stress in the soil. So the opportunity to restore Fruit Farm Creek has been posed in many ways, trying to get it done over the years. In this case, we posed it as fish habitat restoration because mangroves are a part of healthy marine fish habitat, and especially for juveniles of many sought after species like snappers, groupers, snook, and tarpon. And then, of course, we had the 2017 passage of Hurricane Irma. And there was a fisheries disaster declared after that, which brought with it an opportunity for funding from the National Marine Fisheries Service for large-scale fish habitat restoration projects. So that federal fisheries disaster relief for Hurricane Irma was appropriated by Congress to the state of Florida, and resource managers within the SWIRT group leveraged their partnerships to help assess the natural areas that were affected by Hurricane Irma and identify restoration opportunities. So several large-scale coastal habitat projects were identified, and they were vetted to see which ones had demonstrable negative effects from Hurricane Irma, which Fruit Farm Creek did, and where we could get significant benefit, or what we call ecological lift, by restoring some of these essential fish habitats like mangroves and seagrasses. So selection was made, and the final ones that were selected for this particular fishery disaster recovery included Fruit Farm Creek in Collier County, seagrass recovery in Tarpon Cove in Lake Worth Lagoon on the East Coast, Jensen Beach mangrove restoration over in Martin County, and also a mangrove heart attack you see there on the bottom right at Oleta River State Park in Miami-Dade County. So many of these are mangrove heart attacks, either caused or exacerbated by Hurricane Irma. Just taking a look at Fruit Farm Creek again. So zooming in and looking west to east, we can see that the die-off area has been caused by some clogged drainage. Basically pooling of fresh water in the summertime, a lack of flushing by tidal water in the wintertime. And as Ken mentioned, this was identified by mangrove expert Robin Lewis with the Coastal Restoration Group. So the idea here for restoration will be to install culvert pipes under San Marco Road to allow for tides to flush in and out and freshwater to drain from the mangroves. We then expect seeds and propagules to float in naturally and establish themselves in 1 to 5 years. This was a process Robin called ecological mangrove restoration. And of course, all this work means that there's going to be some heavy duty construction needed. So we're working with the city of Marco Island to install culvert pipes under San Marco Road in 2 locations to allow additional flushing. Of course, all this construction means there's going to be some traffic delays with the work crews, and San Marco Road or County Road 92 is still going to be open. It's a critical roadway to Marco and Goodland. So it will be passable during the construction process. Giving a little bit more of a breakdown of the timeline of the project, it's anticipated to begin in spring of 2021 during our dry season here in Southwest Florida. And the City of Marco Island's contractors will be completing the road work and utility moving to install culvert pipes under San Marco Road. Pipes are going to increase the flow and allow that natural regeneration of mangroves to occur over time, which is a lot more cost effective than going out and trying to plant mangroves on your own. This means that there's going to be that heavy construction that I mentioned. So anywhere between January and June of next year, we can expect some construction and some one-way traffic as we have flaggers on the road. At that same time, FWC's contractors will be actually out in the wetland using equipment to excavate and clear out the tidal creeks. They've silted in on the south side of San Marco Road, and they've sort of exacerbated that clogged artery effect, leading to a heart attack. So all that means that because we're doing some excavation, things are going to look a little bit worse before they start to look better. So these are a time series of images that were taken on the north side of San Marco Road, that original 4-acre restoration that Ken mentioned. And you can see it started out looking pretty rough as we had to dig a new channel through it. And then mangroves have established themselves on their own. No planting was done here. They've just floated in on the tide and naturally begin to grow into a shrubby-like form. And then eventually they'll become more of a tree form and look like a natural mangrove forest. So by year 2 or 3, they should be shrubs, as you see here. And then full canopy, we're looking at 10 to 15 years. So these were the first phase, sort of the pilot phase on the north side of San Marco Road, and showed as a good demonstration project how we can jumpstart restoration. Backing up, here's the aerial image from the top again. My cursor is over that 4-acre area that Ken mentioned. And of course, we've got our tidal creek with blockages here and here. So as we mentioned, the mangroves have died off basically due to that summertime flooding, wintertime lack of water and flushing and low phosphorus levels and soil compaction. The idea here is that we're going to add these culvert pipes, 2 sets of culvert pipes here under San Marco Road, and restore those tidal creek flows. The objective is really to get that canopy cover back where we can, and to use Robin Lewis's concept of ecological mangrove restoration, where, as I mentioned, you're basically letting mangroves reestablish themselves once you get the flow and the surface elevations in line with a natural mangrove. And planting mangroves is a lot less cost effective than this. They're likely to die. They usually have a 20% or less survival rate. So doing this kind of large scale project as opposed to a mangrove gardening project is a lot more efficient and a lot more effective. It's been demonstrated here, but also in places in Southeast Asia where they've had to do a lot of mangrove restoration for various reasons. So this photo basically shows my creative photo editing and what Fruit Farm Creek may look like in about 15 years. You can see the blue flow there that I wanted to represent the tidewaters coming in and out from the north. And natural flushing doesn't actually occur from the south because there's an existing coastal ridge, which is natural in that area. Overall, we're expecting the increase in wetland quality to make a lot better habitat for fish and wildlife. You can see the current state here and what we plan for it to look like in a decade or a little bit more. More productivity coming out of this wetland, exporting some of the nutrients, exporting some of the fish and crustaceans to the estuary means we're going to have more productivity, things like catchable fish. We'll probably see more wading birds in this area. And a healthy mangrove has actually been known to give better property protection. So it can actually decrease storm surges for properties inland of where the mangrove is and provide some resilience to storm surges from things like hurricanes and tropical storms. And Fruit Farm Creek has led to a lot of science research on the front end, but it's also going to lead to a lot of science research on the back end. So partners and researchers with USGS, other organizations, universities, all being coordinated with Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve is setting the stage for a better understanding of how mangrove restoration works. We want to be able to predict these, better understand how they occur and how they're restored, and then assess where areas are in danger of having this happen before it ever happens to them. So it's really going to help us better assess what the future will look like for our mangroves. And we're also looking at studies that'll tell us more about carbon sequestration or blue carbon, the rates of sediment buildup on coastlines in Southwest Florida, the timelines for wetland forest recovery, and also tracking fish usage of restored mangroves. These are all projects I mentioned that are in various stages of ongoing or development. So with that, I'm going to put up my contact information in case there's any future questions about this or about any of the heavy-duty construction. And I have to thank all of the partners listed here, which have given time, energy, and financial investments to Fruit Farm Creek. as well as a lot of local donors and volunteers. So without them, this wouldn't be happening. So thank you, and thank you for joining.
Great, thank you so much, Corey. If you want to stop sharing your screen, that will automatically put all of us into what's called the gallery view. And I just want to remind everyone that if you haven't put your question in the Q&A box, Marissa is finalizing what questions will be asked of the panel here. So we're going to go ahead and proceed to that. I did want to take an opportunity to just mention that although this is the last lecture in the series, there is one more skill building workshop coming up. And so that will take place very soon. And Marissa is going to give a little bit of detail on that as she prepares for the questions. And I'm going to put the link to register in the chat box.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, actually next week we have a two-part workshop on the 21st and the 22nd from Sarah Mason from Duke University at the, I believe it's the Nicholas Institute, and she's going to teach us about using ecosystem services conceptual models. So go ahead and click the link if you are interested in that, and you can learn more. The information is all over the registration page. All right, so now I'll go ahead and get started looking at our Q&A. The question that we have the most votes on is from Anne, and it says, it looks like there's another large mangrove dead zone behind the condominium buildings in the foreground of your picture. Why is that area not going to be included in the restoration area? And Ken, I'll go ahead and direct that one towards you. I believe they're talking about on the to the right of the large 50-acre die-off.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So one of the things that's happening throughout this area, Fruit Farm Creek in particular, but throughout Southwest Florida, is that we're seeing more and more of these die-offs occurring. A lot of areas are stressed, and that particular area that you're talking about, I don't know specifically where it is, but it may benefit. Again, it may benefit from the restoration that's occurring. We're not necessarily targeting the 50-acre, 60-acre, and 10-acre and 4-acre areas. Those are just the areas that we're studying as part of our understanding of what's causing the mangrove mortality. That whole area, 100 some odd acres that is on that image that Corey showed, is going to receive restored tides. And there's some areas too around Hors Island, the Key Marco development, that we established plots there thinking that they would be tidal, that they would be in very good shape, but they're going through the same process of heat collapse right now after Hurricane Irma, and there's likely to be more dead mangroves in those areas as well. So I think that this is really a first step. When you design a restoration project, it takes many years, lots of false starts, and you have to identify a particular area, but the area is way larger than those than that 10, 50, and 4-acre area that we're focusing. So hopefully it includes that area that you're asking about.
All right. Well, thanks for elaborating on that quite a bit, Ken. It's really hopefully helped and kind of conceptualize a little bit more of what the restoration goal is. All right. Next, Corey, I'll go ahead and direct this question towards you. It's a question from Charlie in the Q&A saying, how much additional flushing is expected from the 2 culverts being added under San Marco Road?
Yeah, so actually we do expect quite a bit of flushing. There is currently 1 culvert under San Marco Road that is to the east side of the project area, closer to that smaller die-off area, which is probably why that area is a bit smaller. The culvert is sort of crushed and collapsed though, and it's basically undersized for the amount of flow that needs to go through there to reach back into the mangroves. So we're going to add a second barrel of a culvert there, replace the damaged one, and then also to the west side, put in double barrel 5-foot culverts. So the tide range in this area, if my memory serves, is about 2.5 feet on average. So we would expect all of that additional 2.5 feet to be able to reach that culvert and then the immediate area of the mangrove to flush in and out. And while I don't have an exact number of how far into the mangrove wetland it may push, I imagine it'll push far past that die-off area, ghost forest area, and then probably almost nearly back to the coastal ridge and throughout the entire Black Mangrove Basin there.
All right, great. Thank you so much for answering that question as well. It does sound like it's got quite a bit of work to do on those culverts. All right. The next question we have is from Danielle. And Ken, I'm going to direct this one towards you, especially since she addressed it with, "Hi, Ken." She's asking, can you talk a bit more about the process leads to reduced soil phosphorus conditions you observed in an unhealthy mangrove forest?
Yeah, hey Danielle, it's a good question. So we know that phosphorus will, there's a recycling process that you're also familiar with that keeps phosphorus in the forest itself. So basically, it goes up the tree. It's it's retranslocated in the tree, or it's the leaves are dropped and it's recycled within the system itself. I think what happens is with these particular stress systems is that process is sort of it's bypassed, it's messed up. And we also know that the phosphorus can be flushed in and out with tidal actions as well. So I think it has to do with the balance of water, the hydrology. So you're getting a lot of rainfall into the system. It's flushing out with a lot of rain that doesn't have a whole lot of phosphorus in it. And over time, the flushing that does exist just eventually takes the phosphorus out of the system. It's interesting because where we see, and there's obviously other types of mechanisms that are going to occur as well, but where you see hydrologic isolation in other places, like this one project in Colombia that I think you're familiar with, the Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta, their phosphorus levels are low as well. And what's really shocking is how low these phosphorus levels can be. But yet in other parts of the Everglades, as you know, we're dealing with too much phosphorus going into marshes. That's actually changing the community composition. So it's really a balance of phosphorus. It's just each end of the balance that we're looking at here. It's just that this system's been degraded for 80 years, and eventually that phosphorus is just lost in very small increments over time, I think.
I agree. Perfect. All right. Well, next we'll go ahead and go to the question from Britta. She says, directed to Corey, is the 15 years estimate of recovery based on the results from similar mangrove restoration work? And Corey, there you go.
So in my experience, that was a general estimate based on what I've seen over time for mangroves colonizing areas of salt marsh, and also from what I've seen of mangroves colonizing other restoration sites. And about the time they start to transition from looking shrub-like to tree-like. So people tend to think that it's become reforested when they start to be more tree-like. And I would say it would take about that time frame for them to get that growth form.
All right, great. That's perfect. I hope that answered Britta's question. All right, next on to the question from Bill. And I'm going to say this one could probably go for either one of you. I'm not quite sure who the best person would be for this one. But it says, can a mangrove forest grow in areas without tides? The North Indian River Lagoon is about 20 miles from the inlet and there are no tides. The mangrove trees along the shoreline are not very tall, however, they do grow there. I would like to start a shoreline restoration project and had hoped to use mangroves. Do you have any suggestions?
So I can start out with this one. So mangroves are technically tidal forests, however, or intertidal forests. However, there are situations where mangroves can occur with no tide or very reduced tide. There's several situations that can create that. One being a mangrove forest can be established, and then for some reason or another, sometimes it's very small scale habitat changes, tidal reach or tidal condition of the site can be modified. The mangroves sometimes, as long as the soils are flush and they get what they need, they can still persist under those non-tidal conditions. It's just very uncommon. Now, there are some situations where there's even like on Pacific Islands, there's some mangroves that are like relic mangroves that have been, that are completely non-tidal, but that are sitting there as a sort of a, they developed many, many years ago and the sea conditions changed. So they're really weird looking systems because they're not flooded and they have very exposed root systems with soil oxidation and all these really kind of creepy structures. But what I would suggest for the northern, for the Indian River Lagoon is that you're probably far better off planting or considering planting grasses, marsh grasses. In fact, a lot of the restoration sites, mangrove restoration sites that just been established in places like Tampa Bay region, what people do is they grade the system, they grade the site to some intertidal elevation, and then they just plant it with Spartina bakeri or some kind of grass, and they just walk away. And the mangroves eventually colonize over time. And I think in your situation, if you want shoreline stabilization, that may be one possibility. If the mangroves come in over time, they will. And mangroves can disperse with storm events and high tide events as well. That even though you're not seeing a tide at that location, there's some way they're getting dispersed there somehow. But I would generally think that they can grow in non-tidal conditions. They don't like it. They generally don't establish in that. But there's places where they actually exist in non-tidal conditions. Thanks for the question.
All right, and Bill, I hope that did answer your question. If not, I believe the presenters did provide some of their information, and maybe you can have a little bit more in-depth conversation if needed. All right, so the next question that we have is from Martha, and the question, I believe this would be more so for Corey. Did the success of the 4-acre site help Marco to get the money for the larger project?
So overall, yeah, having a successful demonstration project is always very helpful to show off to potential funding sources to say, hey, we've got this and we know it works, so we can apply it to a larger area if funding is available. In this case, Fruit Farm Creek, we'd really been looking for funding for this large project for a long time, and different things have come up and subsequently not always come to pass. But in this case, it was disaster recovery money from Hurricane Irma that really affected South Florida so negatively. And we were able to sell this project as being successful in a small scale. And therefore, it would be successful on a large scale if we could apply what is a relatively large chunk of change to get this amount of work done. We don't always get to restore close to 200 acres of mangroves. And so this is a really important site and really large scale site for mangrove restoration in Florida and in the US.
It's great. And always a good thing to hear that past restoration work helps future restoration work as well. All right, the next question, I believe this one might be better suited for Ken, and I believe this will be our last question before we end. And it's from Howard. I think, Ken, you might be the best person for this one. Do you see the correlations between elevation change and or canopy cover that might give us an aerial remote sensing data, early warnings of mangrove forest falling into a stressed state?
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. So we are also studying we're tracking the surface elevation change on these same sites using surface elevation tables. And you definitely see elevation losses, obviously, equivalent to the peak collapse story. You see elevation losses at the transitional forest, but what would complicate using things like LiDAR, I think, would be the fact that you have this really thick layer of algal microbial growth on the most impacted sites. But I think that definitely you'd be able to see elevation differences using LiDAR if you were to want to map it that way, and just looking at elevation differences and sort of rectify those elevations relative to the tidal datum. It would be one way to try to identify stress before it actually ends in collapse potentially. So I mean, I think it's worth trying.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for answering these questions. Just due to our time, I want to respect everyone's time this afternoon. So I do see that there are quite a few questions still in the Q&A. If you guys want to stay after, or anyone else who's welcome to stay after, if our presenters would mind answering those questions, then we'd be happy to get through those and give you guys some answers. With that being said, Sarah, I believe I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for any closing remarks and notifications of the reserve.
Great. Give me just a second to make this full screen for you. Okay, perfect. I just wanted to let you guys know about some upcoming programs that we have at the Reserve. As you may know, the Environmental Learning Center is closed to staff and public. We are all working in our remote offices, and we have no timeline for reopening at this time. So our fall programs are, for now, either outside or virtual. So we have all kinds of webinars and workshops, as you can see here. We have a new class called Virtual Binoculars, where we take you to the beach like we used to do for classes, but now you get to stay home and watch through the binoculars what's at the beach. And don't forget, we do have our eco tours. So we are able to take people in person on boat and kayak tours. Coming up, we have a classic car show. This will be the second year, and that's taking place on Saturday, November 14th. So if you are local to the area, we'll hope to see you then. And in December, on the 6th, it's a Sunday, we're trying something new. It's a road rally. If you haven't heard of a road rally, I had to look it up. And you basically are with your family or your quarantine, and you drive from place to place safely, you know, socially distanced and whatnot. And it's like a scavenger hunt around town. And so I think that's going to be really fun. If you guys are local or will be by December, check out our website, rookerybay.org. And don't forget our excursions in the field. That's our Rookery Bay education team taking you on an excursion while you are at home and we're in the field for the time being. So I'm really glad you could join us today. I hope that you'll join us again on a future opportunity. And like Marissa said, anyone that wants to stick around, we'll have Ken and Corey for a few minutes that we can continue answering questions. But anyone that needs to drop off for their next meeting, go ahead and zoom on over to the next room. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
All right. So let's see.